which one of you would like to go first?
Secretary Lehman.
Yes, thank you. That very helpfully augments and elaborates some of the earlier testimony we had today on this issue. There's no question there needs to be a process for establishing standards in these areas. So far, we've heard no consensus about how this is to be done. Both of you have had extensive experience in governmental and in dealing with private sector environments. We need some specific recommendations with regard to where do you recommend the leadership reside in establishing an environment? We heard explanations that are quite valid that there are real restrictions for companies, particularly in the insurance industry, getting together and setting standards. There are competitive, there are Sherman Act kinds of problems. We heard these same things when the ISO standards were begun in the engineering world, that this was some kind of constraint of competition and so forth. But we have precedents where the ISO 9000, ISO 14000 standards have been set without really government leadership in doing it, but in government encouragement and a kind of a willingness on the government's part not to pursue antitrust and anti-competitive kinds of enforcement where these things make common sense. In fact, in the case of Insurance Services Office, there was a specific exemption under McCarran-Ferguson to allow the pooling of this kind of information, which has led to tremendous benefits in setting of standards, for instance, in rating local code enforcement for building codes and fire codes and so forth. That exists. Do you believe, I would really like to get specific recommendations from each of you on what we as a commission, with this rare opportunity of the total focus of both Congress and the executive branch, ready to willingly or unwillingly act on what our recommendations are. What should we recommend? There's no question we need a standards process to set standards in these areas. Should it be mandated from Congress? Should there be a new kind of non-governmental organization like ISO set up specifically to do these standards with a mandate to do it? Obviously, it can't be done purely at the federal level because every local jurisdiction it has its own unique set of issues and requirements. You can't impose what you'd want for the Empire State Building on a two-story garden apartment complex in Florida. So could you get down to specifics in recommending a program for what this commission, in your judgment, could do in its report to see that real action is taken?
To answer your question directly, as far as building design goes, there are standards-making organizations already. I mean, they exist. The NFPA and the ICC are the two recognized code-writing bodies here in the United States. The problem is, of course, that they're a private sector entity that doesn't report to anyone other than their membership. So as far as the federal government is involved, I think the only solution to that is to strongly encourage through DHS a meeting of the minds. They do have the ICC and the NFPA both have relationships existing within FEMA and within the U.S. Fire Administration, and I think that can certainly be an area that you could explore specifically to move it forward. I think if DHS was to, for example, to hold a conference on this or some type of, again, meeting of the minds to move it forward, I think that could happen. As far as emergency response protocols within the private sector, again, there's a bunch of them out there right now. The problem is that there's no single one that it's followed everywhere, and that's one of the issues here. I mean, this is fundamentally, as I mentioned earlier, that code enforcement is considered to be a local and state function, and the fact that these are national issues makes it very difficult to try to massage this into a way that we can have some kind of uniformity across the United States. I would have hoped that, there was a chance 5-6 years ago that the NFPA and the ICC actually were in partnership to develop a single national building code, and it fell apart. And the fact is we have two of them now, right here. We've got two codes that are used nationally, and they're competing with each other, trying to see which jurisdictions will adopt them. So again, the only thing I can suggest is strong encouragement from DHS.
Well, is there a certification process with teeth that could be used in this case? I mean, Congress could mandate that if that there are these, say, two certification agencies, and if one or the other is acceptable, if they meet the standards, but that if a building is not certified to it, then there are real penalties to it.
There isn't any, to my knowledge, any certification specific for buildings. That's the problem. Of course, these code writing bodies only write the codes. They don't go out and look at buildings. They have them there, they develop them, and then they're adopted by the cities and states. So there is no existing certification process for buildings. I could say that, my experiences when there were NIST hearings, or I should say House Science Committee hearings a year and a half ago, when the issue came up of should there be federalization, for example, of building codes, you could feel the room shake when that was brought up. And so this is a very sensitive issue. And again, it's a states' rights versus federal authority. And again, it's one that I don't know the simple answer to that. I mean, like I said, I think as far as moving the codes forward, DHS is your best route. As far as, having a certification process, I think it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's certainly an important thing to have, and perhaps some third party could organize something like that along the EMAPS route as a model, basically.
I wonder if I could add, Mr. Secretary, that I think that perhaps we should be looking at not just a role for DHS, but Congress obviously plays a very, very important role, and perhaps there should be a two-step type of process on that. That the Congress and the administration should not be, in all likelihood, setting the standards themselves. The standards to have widespread support and buy-in need to be scientifically based and have great deal of involvement from the private sector and the federal, state, and local governments also, but the private sector really has to buy into those adoption of the standards. What the federal governments could do, what Congress and the administration could do, is begin to set the priority areas. What are the areas that would most benefit from standards? Design certain types of playbooks. What are the common scenarios that we as a nation must really begin to become better prepared? Is that a bio attack in a major urban area? Is it an attack on the power grid? Is it a weapon of mass destruction in a port that would have significant supply chain ramifications? And really lay out, storybook out, design the playbooks that we must be concerned about. And secondly, then identify the points of intercession that may be non-obvious to begin adopting standards. One of the best ways, as we've heard testimony before, is standards should not come after the fact. They should be incorporated up front into the design of a building, into the design of a system process. There are opportunities, as we discuss, important recapitalization of infrastructure in the United States over the coming years, to identify points of intersection in which Homeland Security standards could be interjected into, for example, the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Acts, as we're fundamentally thinking about recapitalizing our mass transit infrastructure, our highway infrastructure, building in Homeland Security principles. As we're debating energy policy, how we can make the power grids and the supply side more secure. As we're debating recapitalization of emergency rooms, how we can augment the capabilities to deal with a bioterrorism attack. And then have the executive branch and legislative branch inventory and identify the entities that have the ability to do scientifically based consensus standard setting themselves. Is that ISO? Is that ANSI? There are many other bodies that have been talked about, but I would suggest a two-step type approach along those lines.
Well, I agree with that, but isn't it time to cut to the chase and name a specific, like they did in the case of ISO, a specific organization that has the certification authority, even though it's a non-governmental? I mean, otherwise it's more meetings and bureaucracy without real standards being established. And it doesn't have to be done by the government. It should be done on a more decentralized basis, but with a certifying authority like ISO.
I think there's a great deal of support on that. The ISO certifications were sometimes criticized by industry as being very, very complicated to actually obtain. But even an interim approach of a self-certification would be a great advancement.
But see, that's exactly the right precedent, because everybody moaned about ISO and, oh, how can you comply? Now, most big OEMs will not buy from a supplier that is not ISO certified, because in fact it turned out to be a very valid set of standards and is constantly being evolved, and it's not the government doing it, yet it has all the full effectiveness of more effectiveness than a government mandate.
And I think history has shown that the increased costs of complying with the standards can be offset by the stability and reliability in the business chain that is created by the adoption of those standards. I think that we do have to adopt more than a voluntary approach, that it may require legislation to begin to adopt a carrot and stick type approach, because there also needs to be some review of the statutory authorities available to centralized agencies. If we're going to adopt the standard approach, there may be a requirement to begin to direct resources from the federal agency to actually begin to direct the resources of the federal, state, private sectors in an emergency situation. We should do a comprehensive review of whether or not sufficient authorities do exist, or under what circumstances could those authorities be executed. So I believe it will take some concerted legislative action, as well as some budget reallocations to have management attention being paid from the administration to this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Congressman Roma?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always difficult following Secretary Lehman. He does such a great job getting right at the heart of some of these questions. Dr. Corbett, thank you for your time. You come very highly recommended by the families. Dr. Yim, thank you. And I want to just take 10 seconds to thank the General Accounting Office for all their excellent nonpartisan work. As a former member of Congress, I used the General Accounting Office many, many times, and you put out an excellent product. And I also want to say that in the joint inquiry that I served on, the General Accounting Office provided us with one of our most valuable employees, Rahul Gupta, who I think is here today. And we appreciate you being here. Take our appreciation back to Mr. Walker for his leadership there at the General Accounting Office. Let me be very blunt with you. The first time I read through your testimony, Dr. Yim, I thought this is pretty confusing and complex, and how do we get at this? How do we better understand it? And I thought about maybe too simple of an analogy, but let's say I represented the University of Notre Dame's basketball team, and Secretary Lehman represented Navy's basketball team.
You'd be in trouble.
And besides being up against a formidable opponent who would probably beat by 12 points, but we would want to assess our vulnerabilities and Navy's vulnerabilities. We would want to know what we're doing right, what plays would work, what plays would specifically work against his team. We would probably have some films and some scouting, and we would have a priority of plays that we would want to run in certain situations against his defense. I think what you're saying in standards and developing a set of standards for the government is that 2 years after 9/11, in many ways, with our critical infrastructure needs and our priority for spending in Congress and in the administration, we still don't have a good way to measure our progress and our priorities and our results in this. And let me try to get more firmly at this by asking you some questions. Let's say Congress decides to prioritize first responders and spend billions of dollars on them. Who has set the first responders as the highest or one of the highest priorities, and how do we determine what to spend money on? Is it walkie-talkies? Is it hazmat suits? Is it a watch list for terrorists? And how do we measure what communities are getting those types of equipment to best make sure that we are best prepared for the terrorist attack that's going to happen in a year or 2 years?
I think that what the priority setting should focus on capacity and capabilities and leave the actual solution, how to meet those capabilities, to individual sector or region variations. One of the great mistakes, I think, in reflecting my past in the Department of Defense, and responsible for our military installations infrastructure, was when we dictated to the private sector or to others how to do things for the Department of Defense, as opposed to saying we needed certain types of performance goals or things done for us according to certain standards. I think the great role that the federal government could play is saying we need first responders to be able to meet these types of performance goals, these performance standards, have these certain types of capacities. We're going to leave it up to you because the maturity of their existing infrastructure varies by sector, by regions. We're going to leave it up to you on how you're going to finance this, how you're actually going to meet these type of performance goals specific to your particular region, but we're going to measure you against your ability to be able to perform to that certain level over time. And we're going to judge the efficacy of our federal grant programs, our federal stimulus programs, in raising you closer to those performance capacity levels. So rather than a mil specification type approach, a more performance approach that the military has adopted, I think holds great promise.
Well, with respect to the different priorities that we should be spending money on in fighting the war on terrorism and better preparing our critical infrastructure out in the country, let's say, according to these reports, that there are 104 nuclear power plants in the United States. Who determines if that should be a priority to protect those, and then how do we measure the best way to protect those and how many of them are protected currently?
That fundamental policy decision must, I think, reside both in the Congress and the executive branches. I don't think either entity could do that by itself. There's certainly budget implications as you begin to set the priorities. So both the administration must propose that budget, the Congress must consent and approve. There's going to be regional variations. There's going to be statutory changes that are likely to be necessary. I think there has to be some sort of joint effort. So it could not just reside in DHS.
Okay, you're too nice a guy here. Let me push you a little bit harder. Has Congress or the administration proposed which ones of those plants are more vulnerable or more important than others? How many, can we currently ascertain how many of those we have protected, if any?
I think that we are lax in completing our threat vulnerability assessments.
2 years after 9/11, we have not adequately prepared our threat vulnerability assessment on even nuclear power plants.
And I think that we have examples of this moving forward. For example, in the maritime safety statutes require vulnerability assessments to be completed. I understand they're on track by the end of this year, first part of next year for our major ports. It's that type of activities that must be completed.
Now, Dr. Yim, when you say that too, let's say we complete it and we say that the following plants are more important than others, and this is a top secret document, and we're also assessing how many we've protected. You're also saying that it shouldn't be dependent upon Congress to fund that, because Congress may have certain people on certain committees that are more interested in getting money to one state, or members on the Appropriations Committee to another particular region or state than others. How do we make sure that those monies would currently reflect the standards and the strategy of that document, whether it was a document assessing the number of power plants, nuclear power plants, or where nuclear power plants were in line of comparison as priority to the power grids, the seaport containers, the hazmat suits, the cybersecurity needs of this country?
It's obviously not an easy question to answer, but if we consider this as purely a program that's funded by the federal government, then I think we would have those difficult problems of dealing with individual jurisdictions. But it's clear that the federal government doesn't have enough money to do it that way. If we think of the federal programs as stimulus programs, a combination of tax policy with direct grants, with liability standards or provisions that are imposed that provide a series of drivers for people to become better prepared, either financial incentives or liability incentives or both, then I think that perhaps we can generate more than just political momentum for that. There's a business self-interest for the private sector to adopt some of these standards, just to assure the viability, the stability of their own business model. In many ways, in the environmental arena, despite the initial aversion to adoption of environmental management standards, over time, not only did people incorporate green sources to minimize their liabilities, they incorporated waste minimization, energy conservation that improved their bottom line. If we could devise federal stimulus programs that provide both carrots and sticks, incentives that are economically driven, stability, reliability driven, rather than just give people money, then I think we have the opportunity to overcome.
Theoretically, let's say we do that. Let's say we devise a system of carrots and sticks and we come up with a pot of federal and state and local monies to incentivize that. And let's say, furthermore, hypothetically, you're on a commission that the Congress and the executive branch puts together to try to determine what priorities should be first in place for this incentivizing structure or priority of standards that are implemented. What recommendations would you make in terms of such important things as nuclear power plants, our water systems, our electrical grids, and cybersecurity? How would you rank those four things in terms of their importance for standards? Or
that is virtually impossible for particularly the GAO to be able to rank.
I'm asking you to get out of your GAO hat, not officially put it on a GAO letterhead. You're a personal member of this commission now. How would you try to ascertain the best way to prioritize?
And even when I think of it personally, Congressman, it's very difficult because you cannot compare the value of the safety of citizens of Oklahoma versus citizens of New York versus citizens of New Jersey. It's inherently such a difficult policy decision to begin to rank those priorities. I think that a better approach would be to tie it to threat risks analysis, a risk management approach. Can we link the priorities to the anticipated threats? It's not a question of is one sector more important or another? Okay. What are the anticipated threats that may occur? Can we link the priorities to that?
You're good at getting away from my question. Let me try to conclude here and ask Dr. Corbett this based upon maybe threat assessments then. Let's say, hypothetically, that the intelligence that comes in since 9/11 and what this commission puts out says that in terms of monuments or historic buildings or skyscrapers, some of your areas of expertise, that terrorists had prioritized or thought about attacking, the following sites. And you've seen some of that in the press. We can put together some lists of priorities. As Dr. Yim has said, you can't do everything. You have to begin somewhere. That's what standards do for you. In terms of the list of 460 skyscrapers in this country, how would you assess the progress we've made in the last 2 years on better protecting the top 25 of those skyscrapers from a catastrophic terrorist attack and improving on the problems and the difficulties and the errors in the World Trade Center?
Well, I think, if you look at just, for example, just high rises, the risk, the level of risk for each one of these buildings, either within New York or around the country, is really assessed by the building owners themselves. I really don't think that we've done a very good job from a city, county, and state perspective of identifying target hazards within their communities. Maybe let me illustrate it with an example here. I am a captain in a small fire department in Bergen County, about 10,000 people. We're a volunteer department. There's 69 fire departments in Bergen County, so we have an extensive mutual aid system. It works pretty well. I mean, we've used it for many, many years. The county did receive some funding for purchase of hazmat suits. We did buy apparently 5 what are called level, and you've probably heard this before, level B protective clothing, sets of clothing for each piece of fire apparatus in our county. The problem for me is that, and again, I'm a mid-level officer in one of these departments, is that it's not clear to me what my responsibility is. What risk assessment has been done within our county. I'm sure our county OEM, county fire marshal has done some of that work, but I think we've done a very poor job of communicating if in fact there has been a risk assessment done within these communities of what our responsibilities are, because again, as a local responder, we potentially could go to surrounding communities where there are large amounts of shopping malls. For example, Paramus, New Jersey is a very large center around New York that has a lot of shopping malls. And to myself, I don't understand exactly what my role is there if we do get a terrorist attack. I mean, obviously we're going to respond to it, but being a person who teaches about hazardous materials and things, level B suits have very limited application. They can be used certain places, certain chemicals, certain things like that. And again, I haven't seen, there hasn't been any playbook or any kind of document that I could look at and said, okay, the county has done a risk assessment and has identified the following 15 facilities as being the primary target hazards, and here's how we're going to go about, here's the threats at each one of them, and here's how we're going to go about dealing with each one of them. I have not seen that, and I would suspect that, just anecdotally, I've talked to other fire people across the country, I think, and you may have heard that here, is that the first responders are still in a murky area, that there are some cases equipment's being bought and things, but where it fits into the big picture, and again, has that risk assessment been conducted? Nobody can say yes or no, because I don't think there's any one entity that's in charge of doing this. I mean, there's money being thrown around, but tying money to risk and that kind of thing, I don't think we've done a good job at that. I would suggest that there is a model out there, through our regulations, EPA regulations, SARA Title III, for example, where local communities have to set up committees basically to respond to hazardous materials incidents. This is from several years ago, and maybe that's the kind of approach we need on the county level, typically across the country, to have a committee like that, a terrorism committee, if you want to call it that is responsible for identifying the top 20 target hazards within their county, and then develop a plan to respond to those. Because a lot of the risk assessment, in my opinion, has been done within the private sector of their own facilities, not any, that I can see visible, any public sector entity.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's just a key question, is if you get $100,000 in your local community and you have no risk assessment plan, and we're 2 years after 9/11, are you going to buy 5 hazmat suits, or are you going to put more patrols around your nuclear power plant? Nobody knows 2 years after. We don't have that kind of direction out there at this point, even for something as basic as what the local responders might do. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman. Last question from Commissioner Gorelick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have just one question. I would like to follow on Commissioner Lehman's and Commissioner Romer's sense of urgency on the issues that you two have presented to us today. And I look at your background, Mr. Yim. We worked together at the Defense Department. You operated at the intersection of the public sector and the private sector and leading the effort on privatization. So you know how difficult this is. And I was struck with respect to both of you that you have a sense, you have a comprehensive and astute perception of what needs to be done and isn't being done. You now both sit outside the executive branch of government. And I would put, just for convenience sake, this question to Mr. Yim. It is striking to me that the Department of Homeland Security, whom we invited to come here at a very senior level, but who declined to provide someone at a very senior level, that's the department you would think would be doing the things that the two of you have been talking about today, whether it is setting priorities, whether it is doing these community-based assessments, whether it is creating a standard-setting process. So I'm going to do what Secretary Lehman did with another panel this morning. and because we've been asked to hold people responsible. And I'm going to ask you this question. If you look at what the Department of Homeland Security has done to date on the subject of risk assessment, setting standards for physical security, setting standards for systems, if I asked you, are they very helpful? Are they not helpful but not harmful? Or are they an obstacle? Which would you say?
I think in terms of requiring that the risk assessment, vulnerability assessments be completed, that they certainly are not trying to do any harm, but they could be much more aggressive about requiring that those be provided and by sector, be completed and provided to policymakers. In terms of setting standards, there's been a great deal of attention in the Department of Homeland Security setting individual product standards. They've created a Homeland Security standards panel. It has paid less attention to the systems type approach, the vertical integration that I've talked about. Again, I don't believe that people are trying to do harm or trying to do a bad job. They could be much more aggressive, in my opinion.
Mr. Corbett?
Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Yim that they're not, I don't think they could be considered harmful from the standpoint they're not doing anything about it, perhaps. I think the ball's in their court to take the lead role here, both in terms of developing county, it seems to me county is the best level to do a county-based terrorism committee that makes that risk assessment, prepares the plans, make sure it's communicated to all the emergency responders, the equipment is purchased that relates specifically to that level of performance that Dr. Yim is talking about. That needs to happen, and it's not. The codes, again, as I mentioned earlier, FEMA has probably the closest, and within them, the U.S. Fire Administration is the closest relationship with ICC and NFPA, and they need to take that leadership role of prodding the NFPA and ICC into moving forward with the development of those documents, because again, there's no standards out there, and if we're attacked again, we're going to see where our vulnerabilities are. I mean, and this is a very complex issue. I mean, we spent at John Jay, we spent an entire day talking about glass. We just talked about glass. The only thing we discussed was glass, and there was no consensus even then of what exactly we should be doing in terms of glazing within buildings, because we know that glazing kills a lot of people, not just here in the United States, but around the world during terrorist attacks. So Again, I think it's harmful from the standpoint that we're not moving forward on it. That's definitely something I think should be said.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both very much.